Health and Risk Communication Center, our ESPP program, and Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He researches media coverage of environmental affairs, environmental journalism practices, risk comm, and the links between media and policy. He has a particular interest in the coverage of environmental issues in Latin American media and also US Latino media. Full disclosure, he's also my PhD advisor. And he's awesome.
So you better do good.
Yeah, I think I will. We have Jennifer Weeks, who is the Environment and Energy Editor at The Conversation. I keep calling it conservation, so I bolded the word. Right. Which is a nonprofit website that publishes articles written by academics, edited by journalists, and aimed at the general public. So for over 10 years, she was a full-time freelance journalist specializing in environment, science, and health. She's written for more than 60 newspapers, magazines, and websites, including the Washington Post, the Boston Globe magazine, Popular Mechanics, etc., as well as for foundations, universities, and nonprofit organizations. Before she was a journalist, she worked as a congressional aide, a public interest lobbyist, and a political analyst for 15 years. And we have Dave Poulson, who is the Senior Associate Director for the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism. He teaches environmental, investigative, public affairs, and data analysis reporting, and organizes workshops in the US and abroad to help journalists better report about the environment. He also teaches classes and workshops and produces videos to help scientists and other researchers better explain their work. Dave has also got over 22 years of a journalism experience as a reporter and an editor. He is founder and editor of the Great Lakes Echo and the Food Fix on campus. Here, I'm gonna cut it off at that, and then we're just gonna jump right into it. We'll hear from our panelists, and our discussion will largely be informal, but I will jump in and redirect if we feel like we're focusing too much on one question and other people have other questions that they want to ask. So, yeah, go for it, Jennifer. We can go in order or however you want to go.
Okay, well, I can start, sure. So let me just explain a little bit about what the conversation does. We recruit scholars at colleges and universities to write articles for us, and the idea is to unlock their knowledge and get it out into the bigger conversation out off campus. And so they write the articles, we journalists on staff edit them, and then we push them out. We publish them on our site and push them out to republishers, which can be anything from the Washington Post to Scientific American to the Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania Spirit, which picks up a lot of our stuff because they need coverage whenever it's not Groundhog Day. So, and the idea really is to just, get the scholarly knowledge out there into broader discussions of what's going on. So we are publishing for a U.S. audience. It's going to be different. Things I'll talk about are different from what some of the folks here are thinking international are doing. And what we're looking for our scholars to publish is reports on their research, commentary on things that are going on, perspective, so sort of adding, their knowledge to what's happening. Covering the environment right now in the US are a couple big challenges, I would say. First of all, because you have this Trump administration that is very, very anti-environmental protection, we could spend all our time writing about Trump is deregulating this, Trump is deregulating that, Trump is rolling back this and that. We had to make a really conscious decision not to focus completely on that because it's just a complete downer and a turnoff. So we do a lot of coverage of that. When one of the neat things about doing environment is that you have scientists and lawyers and economists and policy scholars who all sort of come together in this area. So we've had a lot of people in the sort of policy law area taking apart a lot of the regulatory rollback ideas that the Trump people have proposed and really explaining what works, what doesn't work, and why. We also have written a lot about things that are happening at the state and local level that are more positive for the environment and things that are succeeding there, because we want to show it is not all gloom. So that striking that balancing act has been a challenge. Another challenge that we're wrestling with really that's been harder is finding what we consider not wacko, but mainstream conservative views. I mean, I'm sure most people know that in US academia, the opinion tends to skew liberal. And so we could fill our page with nothing but critiques of everything Trump is doing. We really try to find legit conservative perspectives, not just on the environment, but on all kinds of issues. And it's a constant challenge. So it's something we really work toward. Then we also have a sort of a question that I would say is a bigger one that doesn't really have to do just with Trump, but the fact that in this age when the media environment is exploding and you have all kinds of different information sources, and it's getting harder and harder to tell what is a news source and what is a commentary source and what's an entertainment source, because they're all blurring together. What's the role for experts? And sometimes professors say, what is the point of writing in a time like this when, you know, there's all this fake news and infotainment, and what does anybody care about, you know, expertise and facts anymore? And the answer that I say is, well, a lot of people read our stuff, you know, so I do know that there's an audience out there for them. And so in addition to having them comment on stuff that's in the news and that's, you know, going on in public policy and stuff, we do a lot of other kinds of stories. One type that's really popular for us, especially with science issues, is explainers. How do tornadoes form? Is wildfire smoke bad for your health? What is causing Florida's huge double outbreak of algae right now? We've done articles on all of those things that are just people who know those topics explaining them really clearly, and they've been very popular. And then also reports on new cool research. You know, people are doing all kinds of interesting work on environment and nature and environmental science issues, and you don't want to lose sight of that by just focusing on, you know, what's happening in Washington, D.C. So we try to really spotlight neat work that we learn about from science releases and all kinds of other places like that, and remind people that we're learning about, you know, new species that no one's ever heard of, and figuring out new angles on problems like treating contaminated water and all kinds of things that really matter. So, you know, I think the danger with all kinds of solution stories like this is you don't want to do sort of solutions that are lightweight and not really significant. So you know, I have a real beef with people who do articles about, like, it's easy to be green, you know, do this, you know, get a hemp shower curtain and aren't you sustainable? Or, you know, a surfboard made of certified, you know, forest stewardship council certified wood for your surfboard, you know, as you jet all over the world to go surfing. So you don't want to do like sort of insignificant or kind of, you know, goofy solutions to things. You want to make sure they're really substantive and will make a difference, and so that's a challenge in itself. But I think there's a lot of interesting research and innovation to spotlight what's happening. Stop there.
Oh, you have plenty of time. We can.
I think that pretty much put it out there.
Yeah,
So,
I'll have questions.
I talk fast. Yeah.
All right, Dave, you're up.
Yeah, so when Apoorva first gave me this question prompt, I thought, geez, we only got 5 panelists in a limited amount of time. Where do you begin? You know, challenges to environmental journalism. I just want to do 3 quick ones. 2 are real traditional kinds of challenges that we've always had, journalists as a whole, let alone environmental journalists. And then one emerging one, and I would say that maybe they're kind of linked by the emergence of and impact of technology on our profession. So the first 2 I kind of draw upon. I took a group of journalism students to Canada on a reporting trip last week. And what was fascinating to me is we had all these stops signed up, you know, figured out we're going to stop here, we're going to talk to so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. Before this one interview that we're going to do, we ran into this sandwich shop real quick to get a bite to eat. And so we grab a sandwich and something to drink, and we sit down, and this guy comes out to serve us, and he's serving us tea. He's got this thick British accent, okay? And he's giving iced tea to everybody. And somebody takes a drink of iced tea from the straw and says, oh, a paper straw. And he says, yeah, I pay 17 cents a straw for that. And well, why do you do that? Well, people in this community is very concerned about the environment. It's a retirement community. Old people, you know, they have time to worry about the environment. This is what this guy is saying. He's going on and on and on. And I said, well, this is very interesting to me. And he says, well, why is that? And I said, well, because we're an environmental journalism group from Michigan State University. And you know what? We write an awful lot about plastic pollution. You know, well, that just like sent him off. You know, and he's going on and on about these straws. We get him talking to him. How did you get here? And he says, well, I used to be in the British military. And we said, yeah. And he says, you know what I think your students should write about? And I said, what? And he says, well, you know, they used to send me out into shooting ranges and bombing runs to quantify invasive, or not invasive species, endangered species. Now, it's a really good place for them to grow. I said, what are you talking about? And he says, well, nobody's going to bother them right there, right? You know, they grow out there. Nobody goes around on a shooting range. It's really, really a biodiverse region. It's pretty exciting stuff. And he says, nothing bothers them. I said, well, yeah, except for an occasional bomb. He says, no, that's a good thing. So a bomb creates a crater in this area, and it fills with water. And before you know it, you get this kind of ecosystem on the margin of this little tiny water thing. And he's going on and on and on about this. Pretty interesting stuff, right? Okay, he does this in the military. And I said, so what, you were an environmental expert? No, they sent me down the Falkland Islands. I counted penguins down there. He says, you know how you count penguins? He says, you sit very, very still and they think that you're nesting. And then they come right up to you. And they nest right next to you, you know? And then you start counting penguins. Okay, here's a guy chock full of story, right? Okay, I'm afraid that we are losing that we are not getting that engagement. We talk about engagement with audience all the time. And that's certainly very, very important. There's something about engagement with sources. And this face-to-face accidental interaction, I think we're losing that because we are so driven to write very, very fast, get stories out there, do a lot of reporting on the telephone. That's why he's complained about this. It's worse now than it's ever been. Okay. So the other thing that kind of troubled me about this, so I said to a student who was writing a story about plastic straw bans in the Great Lakes region, I said, that guy's a pretty good interview. That guy's the lead to your story. And she goes, yeah, too bad we don't have any more time. I said, well, we've got time, you know. No, I don't think there's enough time to interview this guy. She says, maybe when I get home, I can find his phone number and give him a call back. Okay. And I think this technology is something that we often default to, put between ourselves and our sources. So that's one of the challenges that concerns me. The other is just, again, persistence. All right, so one of our interviews fell through. Okay, it's Friday afternoon at 4:30. My Monday morning interview just calls, says, we're not going to do it. All right, what do? I called up a museum and I said, hey, you got time for us to come see your museum in this area that we're going to be visiting? Well, yeah, what are you interested in? Well, environmental stuff. We've got the foremost environmental stuff that you've ever seen, says the museum woman. Too bad you're coming when that floor is closed. Okay? So I said, well, maybe we'll stop by anyway, and thanks for your help. And just before she hangs up, she says, well, you could always, you know, visit our marijuana farm. I said, what are you talking about? She says, I don't know, it's called 7 Acres, something. So I get online and I look up 7 Acres marijuana farm, okay, in Kincardine, Ontario, okay. And I didn't realize it, but recreational marijuana is set to go legal throughout Canada on October 17th. Timely news, right? Okay, so they've got this 7 acres under greenhouse. They're growing pot there, right? They've been doing it for the last 3 or 4 years for medicinal reasons. They're doubling their capacity, okay? And they're growing marijuana in South Africa, and they're going to the Netherlands to get the best seed, the strongest genetic seeds. I said, we're going to go to this pot place, right? Okay? So I call them up. Nobody answers. You know, it's after 5 o'clock by this time, all right? So I call them on Saturday. Well, we're closed Saturday and Sunday. Mm-hmm. So we go to Canada on Sunday, all right? Monday morning, I call them up, and they said, are you nuts? Do you know how hard it is to get into this place? You have to go through security checks. You have to wear biohazard suits. We set these up weeks ahead of time. And I said, well, let me talk to somebody else. So I talked to somebody else. I said, you know, we're just up here for just a, you know, a couple days, you know, get us into this place. We really want to do. Now there's already too many tours. Oh, there's just a few of us. Just tag us on it. No, you can't do this. All right, probably what you could do is you could send an email to Joe Schmo, and maybe he'll set something up in a couple weeks. All right. So they give me the email address. I write Joe Schmo an email, okay, and I go down and I tell the students, get in the car. We're going out to this marijuana place. So we go out there. We can't find it. All there is this grimy industrial site, you know. And you know what? That's the marijuana place. It's a huge construction site. 600 people. You know, it's incredible. Great paying jobs. So I go up to this construction guy and I say, hey, we need to get in there for a tour. He says, buddy, I'm just building this stuff. You know, I can't get you in for a tour. You need to talk to that security guy. So I said, okay, because you know what? That gets me 20 feet further into the marijuana. Yeah. All right. The security guy says, you know, I have no idea. Go to that trailer over there and talk to someone in there. I go in the trailer. There's nobody there. I walk out. He says, there's nobody there. He said, I just saw a guy with a tie. I walked around the corner. Yeah. I'm 40 feet into the marijuana plant. Yeah. All right. And the guy with the tie says, you know what? I don't know. I'll find out. So it comes out, brings out the PR person. She says, didn't you get the email that we sent you? She's very, very angry. And I said, no, I was in the car. We just drove out here. We didn't know anything. And she says, well, we just can't do this right now. I said, what's going on here? So she begins to tell me what's going on here. And I said, could you tell my students about this? And she says, well, they can't come in. I said, fine, just tell my students about this. All right. So I bring my students across the road. And we begin to talk to her. We get on the interview. Before you know it, we got an interview. I mean, we got a story. I mean, that's a great story. I tell you the rest of it, but you're going to have to read about it. Okay? Right? My point here is I think we're losing that persistence aspect, and I think the technology sometimes keeps us from doing this. And again, that harkens back to the face-to-face. My last thing, the emerging challenge, I would say, is this interface between science and journalism. I think efforts like Jennifer's are great because we need to make scientists think more like journalists and their responsibility to follow the scientific method, which, by the way, what's the last step of the scientific method? Share your results, okay? So we need to get them thinking about like that, but the journalist side of the aspect has to begin thinking about that the scientists have wonderful analytical tools that become great tools of communication. And if we just say to them, you got anything cool stuff going on in the lab these days? All right, it's amazing what you can come up with. So line 5, hugely controversial issue in the state of Michigan. It was Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab did a wonderful animation for analysis about where the heck does this oil go if that pipe was ever to break, okay? Well, it's all animated. It's all got embed code. Every time you write a story about line 5, you can use that embed code. That was not designed for journalism, but has a very journalistic purpose. I had a student who wrote a story about a ponar dredge, which is a small dredge that pulls stuff off the bottom of the lakes. Same thing been going on for 80 years. Innovation. Put a GoPro camera on it. So they started putting GoPro cameras on it. You can guide where this ponar dredge is. They've got all this video from ponar dredges at the bottom of the Great Lakes. Okay, guess what? That's video for a story about zebra mussels. It's like that. So I think we need to think more in terms of trying to get these tools of analysis into tools of communication. Okay, and then we got to help the scientists think more like the way we do journalists.
I was just about to hold that up, but perfect time. All right. You're up.
Okay, so
Do you want us to pull up your slides?
so I'm gonna send a little bit of research, so I have a part. Sorry. It's very simple. Okay, it's very simple.
This is not it, though,
It's
is it?
mostly images.
That's
We also have a part.
Yeah.
You're
Okay.
Required by the professors union. Or they rip the epaulets off you and they break the sword over your knee.
You're joking, but that's not a joke.
Are you trying to tell me something?
Before I do that, actually, hold on.
Lose your union card.
We're gonna go here, where this is.
Swords are in now, though.
Oh, yeah. You just can't carry them through the
Okay.
airport checkpoints.
Just tell me when you want me to.
Okay, right. Okay, so I don't have cool stories to say, but I think I have some interesting stories. I'm going to take a step back and provide more of a broader look at the challenges in a particular region. I know it's taking like a 10,000 feet view of the issues in Latin America, but that's the work that I'm currently doing. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about something that I just worked on, and I'm going to pass this around. A couple of weeks ago, we published this book.
Just in time.
Just in time. And Professor Chavez, who's was one of the early persons. So we published, and again, I started thinking about this idea of an edited volume of Latin America about 3-4 years ago, I think, because there was no book or no resource looking at, from a research perspective, of those challenges in Latin America. Now, while Latin America, I'm from Peru. Most of my work focuses on Latin America. So what I'm going to talk about today are those main challenges that I think emerge from the 7 chapters that we produced in this book. We look at 7 countries in Latin America: Cuba, Mexico, Latin America and the Caribbean. Cuba, Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Peru. Sorry about the emotion of Chile.
Well, that's what you guys are here to talk about.
Right, so don't feel like I'm going to recruit you for volume 2. Volume 2 will include Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, and You're welcome. So I'm going to present a little bit about the research findings from those 7 countries, common themes that I think are important to understand the coverage and the lack of coverage in Latin America and the Caribbean. The first set of challenges are structural. As you probably know, Latin America and more familiar with South America, all these countries are extractivist economies, right? They're natural resource-based economies, like most of the developing world or the global South, however you want to call countries in transition towards whatever you want to define development as. So the history of these countries are unique. Most of these countries, and I'm gonna use Chile as example since we have our Chilean friends here, only transitioning to democracy in the 90s, right? Coming from a military government. The same happened in Brazil in the 80s, Peru in the 70s, Argentina in the 70s, you name it. Any country, I mean, you look at Central American countries, even worse. So those contextual factors, social, political, economic, certainly shape the relationship between media and institutions, okay? In many cases, those institutions are strongly tied to the media. That certainly constrains the work of journalists. In addition, we're seeing, especially in Mexico, Professor Chavez knows a lot about this, violence against journalists is on the rise. This is also true in many Latin American countries. Can you pass the next slide, please? These Reporters Without Borders and a bunch of other organizations track cases of violence against journalists. These are all journalists that have been killed. Mexico, again, is the place where you find most of those killings related to the drug cartels, but also many cases related to environmental activists. Okay, and there's a long history starting with Chico Mendes in Brazil of violence against environmental activists, and also includes reporters. So those structural factors certainly play into those individual level cases where you see violence against journalists. The next one, I'm going to pull up a story from Mongabe, Latin America. They did this amazing story on illegal and informal gold mining in Peru. I was in Peru this summer with Kara. Kara's here, a student in College of Arts and Letters. We went to the Amazon rainforest as part of an educational project, and we saw some of these illegal gold mines, some of these dredges just destroying the rainforest. Now, the rainforest, especially those in the environmental sciences, know the highly sensitive ecosystem, highly valuable. It plays many ecological functions. But there's a lot of gold there. Why are people mining for gold? Because gold has a high value, much higher than agriculture, much higher than timber. So those are, again, structural factors that play into what we're seeing on the ground. Now, I have an interesting story about the chapter we did for the book on illegal mining in Peru. You see families in the Amazon rainforest that are mining for gold, but they're also part of farming families. They're all part of the same big family. So you have people fighting illegal mining in some of these regions, and they're basically fighting their family members who are mining for gold. So there's very interesting family struggles and conflicts involved in this type of activities. And the same happens with cattle ranching and agriculture in many of these regions, where you have family members trying to preserve a forest while others are actively extracting the resources. And those are all parts of those structural factors that affect these countries. Now, how does that affect journalists? It's a slightly different type of story than the ones that you see in more advanced societies or countries. And it's a lot more dangerous for journalists to go into those sites, access those sources, and report those issues. Okay, next one.
I just want to show Genevieve the source of this article.
Oh, I published that. I produced that article. A lot of work went into that. Yeah,
It's a great story.
Very difficult to get.
Okay. The next one relates to organizational barriers or challenges. And I'm going to highlight two in particular. First, within academia. Okay. Now, we go to the next one. You have right now 3 professors of environmental journalism in this panel. Okay. There are very few places, even in the US, where you find something like this. Okay. If you think about Latin America or African countries or countries in Asia, you won't find those type of resources. So And that's one of the reasons why we have this group of 12 Chileans here to try to give you a little bit of the training that we have available here. In Latin American countries, there is very little training that goes into environmental or science reporting. So we're sending students without the training that it's often needed. There are a few cases of that I can find that they are trying to do this job. So there's a university in Ecuador, San Francisco de Quito, that has a environmental communication specialization. It's not specifically about journalism, it's communication more broadly, but they do a little bit of journalism. So there's a challenge. I try to work with a lot of my colleagues back in Peru, some in Chile, my colleague in Ecuador, trying to figure out ways in which we can support those initiatives and try to create more initiatives. The issue of the environment is still emerging. There's a lot of interest if you look at public opinion polls in Latin America. Climate change, everyone believes in climate change, everyone supports action to fight climate change, so like in the US. Yeah, so there's a lot of concern about environmental degradation because I think a lot of the issues are a lot more salient. People live with those environmental issues in their day-to-day lives. So we need to support more of these efforts. Next slide, please. The second one, organizational, is media ownership. This is not like what happens here in the US. This is just an example of Peru's media ownership, highly concentrated. So the amount of discourses that you see is highly limited. How are we doing time?
We've got a minute and a half.
Oh, crap. Okay, let's go. Next one. Okay, so the next set of challenges, more than challenges are the effects that we see based on those challenges. So basically, if you look at the content, you can see reflected in the content those challenges. Many of the discourses that we've seen through research, content analysis of the coverage of these issues show us that there is a limited amount of discourses that are critical of those neoliberal policies. I mean, most of the countries in the region follow, except maybe Venezuela and Ecuador a little bit, Bolivia. The rest are pretty much neoliberal democracies, and there's very limited amount of criticism of those discourses. Which, if you ask people in these countries, there's quite a bit of resentment and quite a bit of opposition to those policies, but you don't see those reflected in at least the mainstream media. So I've done some of the research on this topic that I've done. Think again, reflect the structural challenges. The lack of resources that media organizations have make them rely on newswire services. So in this particular study, a big chunk, over 30% of the stories were coming from wire services, from using a very and news services do a good job at certain things, but focus on the issues of concern for the Latin American countries was just not there, because that's not the role of the newswire agencies. So there's a lack of local reporting on this that Dave and Jennifer were talking about. And finally, if there's any resemblance, that's my brother.
Of course.
Okay, that's my brother. The other problem that we have, yeah, he's a little harder. Now I put my brother there because there is another challenge for environmental reporting is the lack of sources, of reliable expert sources. University like this, on something like the conversation, you have many potential sources, many expert sources out there that I think more than maybe 10, 20 years ago are more willing to communicate about this. In Latin America, and just like in other countries in the global south, you don't have that luxury of seeking different expert sources that are willing to talk with you and that are capable of talking with you. And I put my brother there because he's a scientist, he's an atmospheric scientist. He leads the atmospheric and the equivalent to NOAA here, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Agency. And he has been put into this position of a science communicator. He was kind of pushed into that position. I want to take a little bit of credit of how good he's doing now. We talk all the time about the best recommended practices. So he's doing a very good job now of being able to synthesize really complex science. He does climate change science. He specifically focuses on El Nino. So now he's a sought after source because he's become good at giving kind of key points about his research.
You didn't put his phone number.
I mean, he was here a couple of years ago, last year, I can remember. Last year, right? But like him, there are few experts that can do that kind of work. And part of it is that we haven't gotten to this point of thinking about science communication as we have here in the US. There's a lot more discussions, a ton of discussions right now about science communication here in the US. That has not happened in Latin America at all. There's efforts here and there, but they're very limited. So that's a big challenge if you're a journalist. Who do you talk to? Okay. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Happy to entertain questions later.
Okay. Eric, you're up.
Our first slide up. I'm going to tell you some stories and a little bit about what they mean. And the theme here are environmental journalists targeted in the crosshairs. So this is our first story. It's about a reporter named Rodney Sy. He's now he's an independent newspaper online publisher from Liberia. And he made the mistake, or I don't think it was a mistake, but he reported on corruption involving the former agriculture minister's misuse of donor funds that were intended to fight the parasitic guinea worm. And he ended up spending 3 months in prison, and he was fined $1.6 million. He spent 3 months in the most notorious prison in Liberia. And his experience and that of 3 other journalists I interviewed, who you'll see their pictures, they've survived arrests, harassment, assault, threats because of their coverage of environmental controversies. But surviving isn't the same necessarily as a return to normal. Many of the journalists I interviewed in the global north and the global south have suffered, and in some cases still suffer, severe psychological and career trauma as a result of their coverage. Sometimes it drove them away from journalism as a career, and in some cases it strengthened their commitment to our mission as journalists. Environmental journalism has been characterized as one of the most dangerous news beats. Journalists are vulnerable because these kinds of stories often involve economic power, political power, corporate greed, government corruption, government incompetence, and in many cases, particularly in the developing world, and Bruno touched on this when we talked about gold mining, conflicts over indigenous rights to natural resources and to land. Reporters Without Borders has highlighted what it calls a hostile climate for environmental journalists. Okay. So let's hear from another one of these journalists. His name is Bartolomus Grill. I call him Bart. He's a South African-based correspondent for Der Spiegel. He was detained by village residents and then by police, and then threatened by a rhino poaching kingpin when he and a Swedish photojournalist were covering poaching in Mozambique. Before he went to the kingpin's village, he'd been told, it's not a problem. There's no danger. Just go on, do your job. So they did. They found the kingpin's house. He wasn't there. His wife was working in the garden. They walked into the garden. She called her husband. All of a sudden, he was furious, and this group of 100 very angry young men and boys showed up, threatened us. They made symbols to kill us, to cut off our heads. The people would say, what's all this about the rhinos? All you white people care about is the rhinos. We see these tourists cross our village, all they care about are the animals, they don't care about us. He was also detained by the militia after the police let him out, and it took diplomatic intervention for him and his Swedish photographer to be able to leave the country. Our third tale Abir Sadi, award-winning Egyptian journalist. She was physically assaulted when she was attacked by thugs who were working for a chemical company that was dumping waste into the Nile River. She told me, they attacked me, they broke my glasses, they nearly broke my leg. They were powerful to the extent that when I went to report to police, the police made it like it was a fight. The police said it would be my case against their case. They refused to send me to the hospital. The company continued its work, the chemical company. One more tale. This is from the Global North. This Canadian journalist named Miles Howe, who's working for a small independent news outlet, an organization he said was not beholden to corrupted editors, as if editors could ever be corrupted. He said our mandate was to provide unreported or underreported stories. And so that mandate took him to New Brunswick, where a First Nations community was opposing exploration for natural gas. He told me many times I was the only accredited journalist witnessing violent arrests, third trimester pregnant women being locked up, guys tackled to the ground. He was arrested several times, his equipment was seized, his house was searched, and the police even offered to pay him for information about what the protesters were planning to do. So all these kind of attacks, these arrests, these assaults, loss of jobs, can trigger short-term and long-term psychological impacts, PTSD, substance abuse. As part of my study, I interviewed a couple of clinical psychologists in New York who specialize in working with victims of torture, including journalists. So what do these journalists do psychologically? In some cases, they do nothing. The guy from Liberia told me at the time he got out of prison, there was only one psychiatrist in the whole country. The Egyptian journalist told me she just talked through with her friends, she meditated, she began learning how to train journalists to protect their own safety, and she fell back on her religion. The guy who was in Mozambique said he was having nightmares. He had talked to a woman whose husband had been killed by that rhino poaching kingpin. So he, for the first time in his long career, went to see a therapist. And the Canadian said for the first 2 years, nothing. Psychological problems, he did nothing about it. 2 years later, he left journalism and he began getting therapy. He's now in graduate school, so he probably needs more therapy. Sorry, PhD students. The journalists who worked for news organizations often had some kind of support structure in their newsroom, in their organization to fall back on for financial or psychological or at least peer support. The freelancers didn't. One of the freelancers I interviewed, a journalist from India who had been threatened with a multi-million-dollar libel suit, found out that her major client disowned her, pulled her story off the web, and she lost her assignments, and essentially she lost her livelihood. Finally, just briefly on the indigenous environmental issues, there's been a nexus, according to some of the research, between journalists and indigenous rights, particularly studies done in Latin America. And it becomes difficult because in the West, there are journalists and there are activists. And there's an ethical boundary. But often, the indigenous rights advocate may also have a radio show, may also be a blogger, may work for an NGO, and it complicates that picture for us as from the West when we define who is a journalist and are they at risk because they are doing journalism or because of their advocacy.
Okay, that was great. Genevieve, go ahead.
Those were all really interesting comments. So again, my name is Genevieve Belmaker, and I'm a sports editor with Medi, and I'm also a contributing editor, so I write reports. And so Manga Bay is pretty spread out. We're a dispersed company. We don't even have a head office. We don't have a newsroom gathered. I've, met my colleagues. I've been with Manga Bay more than 2 years, and I've met a couple of my colleagues once. So we're completely spread out. We're totally 21st century. And I think sort of this nonprofit model that Manga Bay is, it's a nonprofit that supports a media organization, is really part of the future of journalism. Because there's a lot of money there coming, different organizations want to fund journalism. I believe there's more money out there than journalists to write stories. So that's good news for those of us who freelance. And we, at Manga Bay, we have 4 bureaus. So one of the bureaus is in English, one is in Spanish, covers Latin America. One is in India, it's published in English. And then the other is Indonesia. And we work with about 350 freelance journalists in more than 50 countries. So really spread out, really diverse. We work with local reporters and freelancers who are based somewhere like London and they fly in, or they're expats living in Myanmar or somewhere. So we work with both kinds. And we publish hundreds of articles a year. Myself, I produce at least 150 to 170 articles a year. It's a lot of working with freelancers. So I have a lot of, I feel like I have a lot of experience seeing what freelancers go through. And my background personally, I started pretty traditionally. I found somebody to mentor me who was way more experienced. When I was living in New York City, I worked for a daily newspaper as a beat reporter. That part of journalism is so essential, and I'm so glad that that was brought up, that the most impactful experiences in my career are the ones that have been where I'm physically present and reporting on the story. I use my feet to get there, and I'm face to face with the subjects. And those are, really the freelancers that we work with too. The challenges they face is a lot of times getting face to face with the sources, and pretty typical stuff that each country, I work in 13 different countries. Each country is different. Vietnam, the rules of engagement for journalists are completely different than in Ecuador, which are 2 countries that I work in. And I think that freelancing is like a very particular career choice to be a freelance journalist. And we can talk, there's always been challenges in journalism. You can go back 150 years and find all kinds of controversies and challenges, and journalists who are getting in hot water for making mistakes. And nowadays, I think for freelancers, the real challenge is to go into it understanding that you are a small enterprise of one. You are an accountant, you're a travel agent, you are a bookkeeper, you're a schedule keeper, you're your own administrative assistant. You also have to come up with the ideas. And then you have to produce the work. It's really a tremendous amount of work, and it's ridiculous to expect one person as a journalist to master that and to not lose their mind in the process and feel like a failure and feel like they suck and feel like I don't have any good ideas. What am I going to do? This is the career I want. I'll never make any money. The reality is most editors cannot find enough freelancers to work with, myself included. It's a major problem. Like, it's very difficult for us. I wish I got more emails. I wish I got more pitches from freelancers. I rarely get unsolicited pitches.
I feel like you're going to be seeing a lot more from me.
Yeah, so, this is kind of, it may be different than what, is usually discussed. Like, oh, it's a difficult profession, it's dangerous, it's hard to make money. Yeah, but there is unlimited potential to succeed. Really, I like I said, I have a very difficult time finding people to work with. And part of the reason I think is because freelancers don't have all of the tools that they need. So if you think about something as simple as what I did today, I traveled from Seattle to here. I had to arrange, I'm not a freelancer, but we work semi-independently, right? I had to arrange everything. So has anybody in this room ever done that, arranged a trip, a reporting trip? Maybe not internationally, but right? So it's a lot of logistics. The most important part really for us as journalists is the part where we engage with the subjects. We have the time to think and to process what we've seen. Sometimes we're, witnessing something violent, deeply disturbing on a human level. We might have to interview somebody who's had a very disturbing emotional experience, and if we're sensitive, it might really affect us. And that stuff starts to pile on, and then it piles on over time with the stress of trying to run a small enterprise by yourself with really no help. I mean, you go into it really, even if you go to J school, there's only so much you can be prepared for, right? Like, this is how you do the job, but then how do you take care of yourself so that you can have longevity and have a career instead of, oh, I freelanced for a while and, it was great, but I couldn't make enough money, which is the most common thing I hear. And I think that a big part of it is just the lack of balance that a lot of journalists manage to achieve on an emotional and mental and physical level. You really have to take care of yourself physically and make sure that you're not sitting at a desk all day, because that's not really journalism anyway. I mean, sitting at a desk and getting on the phone, it's doing journalism, but if you are face to face and you have those interactions, I think I found over time much healthier for the journalists that I work with, because the freelancers, like say, I work with folks in Myanmar, for example, very dangerous, very unstable, frequent, outbreaks of violence, areas you can't move into, different factions of armed rebel groups and military, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Rampant illegal logging, rampant everywhere, and very, very hard for journalists there just to get from point A to point B, just to go. They may have to take 3 modes of transportation just to get to the people they want to interview. Take a bike, a little motorbike, and a bus, and whatever else. And that kind of stuff takes a toll physically and mentally and emotionally, financially. A lot of freelancers get really beaten down financially and they just give up. So one of the best freelancers I've ever worked with, he was reporting from Liberia, which is a very difficult place to find anybody willing to even, go there because of things like outbreaks of Ebola. And he left and he went and worked for the ACLU. And partly because of money, partly because of logistics, just the strain. And it's such a shame. Lucky for ACLU, but not for journalism. And, it makes you wonder if there's more focus on us having balance as journalists, more focus on us being open about things like substance overuse. It doesn't have to be substance abuse, but substance overuse, like really kind of self-medicating. I mean, I'm talking about journalists who have gone through, you've had like a series of maybe really dramatic stories you reported on. For me, I was in Ferguson. That had a huge impact on me. I was in the Middle East and underneath raining tear gas canisters from the Israeli army and seeing things catching on fire. And, once you're in the middle of a situation where there's any kind of violence, it doesn't even have to be live fire. It can really, like somebody else mentioned, it can be a couple of years down the road. All of a sudden you realize I have to deal with this. And so I think it's really important to include that balance and taking care of ourselves, whether we're freelance or we work for a publication.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with some questions, but do you guys have any questions that you want to start with? Sure. Go for it.
I have a question about what they said about how to make good journalism and not only go and do something fast for just people to watch and like every day I feel like I'm doing work, but I don't feel like I'm going deeper.
Well, pick a really understanding boss. It's a good question. It's really hard. The pressures are intense. And the only thing I can say is trying to find a mixture, because you do have to feed the beast. I mean, you still got to shovel that stuff in and keep things going, but see if you can find ways to back off a little bit so that you can find the time to do that story. And then always be looking for story ideas no matter what you're doing. Always be on the job, I guess. That's, you know, we were on the job when we went stopped off at the sandwich shop. But I feel your pain. I know it's hard.
Can I ask you, are you working, do you write for a publication?
No, right now I'm in my internship at a TV channel for news.
Okay, so you're being worked really hard.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about what kind of journalist you want to be, and really, really try to make that, like, this is what I want to do, and I don't want to do this. And if cranking out stories doesn't feel right to you, and you don't feel satisfied, then make a conscious decision to what kind of things do you want to do, and then just focus on that. If you only want to do long form, there's plenty of work for journalists who want to do long form, including. Please pitch me later. Yeah, I think you should just think about what you want to do, and then gear yourself in that direction. And I think it's particularly important for women to think about that, because we're very apologetic about choices we want to make as journalists. We're like, you know, we feel like we're supposed to do it this way. We have to do this. You have to do that. No, you just have to be good at what you do and be really vigilant and in terms of adhering to the standards of really good journalism. And if you don't want to do short, fast stories and feed the beast, then don't, because you don't have to. And yeah, I think the options are there.
The other thing too is life does get a little better after an internship too.
Yeah, actually, go for it.
This is a question for you, Jennifer, and then Genevieve, you can jump into the question and the second part of the question. Number one, you give us a very prognosis of what the political environment is, which is one of the things that we put in the book, that if you have a political environment that is not favorable to science and communicating environmental issues connected with science to the general public, we are in a difficult condition. And the prognosis that you gave us was a little bit of a challenge, like when we have an environment where even from the White House, we receive just a slap us in the face as to what is what we say. How would you recommend, or what is the kind of recommendations that you could have for young journalists who are facing that, not only in the United States, but globally? And I was thinking, and I was hoping that Europe would be becoming the anchor to save us, the rest of us. I'm no longer very
They've got
optimistic
their own
about
problems,
that.
yeah.
It's happening after the election of Salvini in Italy and the transformation of nationalist elections in Hungary and Poland. I don't think that things are looking very good. So what is the role of the journalists to be continuing doing that, particularly for those who are still students? And then for you, Genevieve, is how do you gonna, I was looking at your website, and you have very good stories. How do you know if those journalists or reporters are good? How do you vet those stories or your journalists to make sure that they have a space in your website? Okay.
Do you mean in terms of like credibility?
Yeah,
Okay.
but credibility not only from the story perspective, but who is the person that
Right.
is
Okay.
reporting. I could be paid by a PR company
Right.
and reporting ISO 1 on the tropics in the Peruvian tropics. I could be paid by, I saw some other organizations that could be willing to pay a PR person to write the story. You see what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, I agree with you that, you know, it's really hard when you have the power of government that is, you know, sending all this bullshit at you, you know, you can't necessarily drown it out. But I think that maybe one thing to think about is, one thing I'm encouraged by is all the different kinds of news outlets in the US that are starting to pop up and fill in some of the space that has been created by newspapers cutting back so much and other big mainstream media outlets. So things like online outlets, Vox does a lot of really great reporting, courts explaining business trends, things like that. And so I think that maybe trying to get in at a place like that, whether it's a nonprofit or whether nonprofit versus for-profit is not so much the thing, but maybe just not assuming that the big mainstream radio, TV, print outlets are the ones who are going to do all of the reporting and fact checking, because some of them, like the Washington Post, are just completely caught up in Kavanaugh mania and stuff like that. And so some of these more specialized, more sort of niche publications, I think, often can do a really good job. And a lot of them, Axios, I had never heard of Axios a year ago, but it's this great website that does really good analytical stories about politics and technology and some of the trends like that. And they're growing. They have readers who want to know about that stuff, who want to understand what's going on in the society they live in. And so I think, excuse me, I'm seeing my eye, thinking about lots of sort of different kinds of outlets that you can work for that do things like that. And then another option, at least in the US, I don't know a lot about whether this exists in other countries, is trade press. Trade outlets that cover one industry, especially like in Washington, there's a lot of specialized publishers that just cover one agency. You can work for newsletters that are called things like Inside FERC, or whatever. Inside Climate News, Inside EPA.
Right.
And so they, will hire people who will know all about one agency and all about all the regulatory stuff they do and legal cases coming through and things like that. Sometimes they do really good stuff, and then it sort of goes up the information food chain, and eventually the big mainstream sources pick up their work and carry it on, and often they steal the glory. But I think that just sort of thinking about the sort of media ecosystem that's become very diverse, and not necessarily aiming for the big prestigious outlets, because often I think you can do better reporting and interpreting and criticizing things if you're at a more specialized place.
So the question was, how do I pick journalists? Just using the same skills I use as a reporter, to size people up as best as I can. I never get to meet the reporters face to face because they're all over the world. So I've never even met one. Well, this is the first time I've ever met a manga bay reporter face to face. Yeah, I just talk with them and try to size them up. And sometimes I'm horribly wrong. Every once in a while, somebody just really doesn't work out and it causes a problem. But most of the time, I think as reporters, we have a pretty good sense for people, like a gut instinct about people. And the longer you're in this job, the more you learn to listen to that gut instinct, to that what's drawing you, to this person or this story. And so I rely a lot on my gut instinct and just just go for it. And it's hard to find reporters who, I think, as freelancers, it's hard for freelancers to understand the balance of working with many different editors and different publications, because they're dealing not only with different editors, they're also dealing with different company cultures and different, whatever the situation, the company politics at the time in that organization. And sometimes there's big shifts with people while you're working on a story. I don't know if anyone has ever had that happen, if your editor disappears or something. So freelancers have to deal with that times however many publications they're working with. And some publications are more demanding and others, and it's a two-way thing. They choose us too, because it doesn't always, reporters we want to work with, it doesn't always work out. They're not available, they might be too in demand. Sometimes that's a good hint if they're in demand, but I work with people who, they're really not very experienced at all, and they just kind of are persistent about staying in touch. And those people, I think, are especially, they're unique because they keep trying, they're really new, and they keep trying to just maintain the relationship. And I think even if you're not getting assignments, as an editor, I respect that, and I will keep communicating with them. And when the chance comes up for them to do something, yeah, of course, because they've demonstrated over time that they're professional and they can do their job.
So I had two questions, but they were both for you and Jen, but she's gonna run out real quick. So I'm gonna ask this to the gentlemen, especially because they have a unique qualification of having both journalism as well as research experience. So this is one of our questions that we got sent to, I think one of our other committee members, Zach, might have sent it in. So he said that environmental and sustainable sciences are really different from precision sciences like chemistry or physics in terms of how they deal with uncertainty and probabilities. And environmental sciences are largely interdisciplinary with high uncertainty and unpredictable side effects at times. But the precision sciences like chemistry or physics are far more accurate in their predictions at times, and they lead to monumental, commonly tangible consequences and accomplishments. So apparently the general public has trouble recognizing the key difference and understanding uncertainty in science. And now that you're back, you can actually jump in. So how do journalists deal with uncertainty when reporting on scientific findings? Whether they're findings from like a really kind of settled, in my opinion, settled issue like climate change, which is not a debatable thing, or you can make it one. But how do journalists deal with uncertainty when communicating scientific findings? And then you guys can, whoever wants to go into
Sounds like Bruno.
Well, the research on scientific uncertainty tells us that typically the coverage goes to the extremes. So either ignores uncertainty or just bolsters up uncertainty. In the case of climate change, 1% uncertainty, oh my God, we don't have 100% uncertainty. That used to be the case in climate change. I don't think it's longer the case. And even in the BBC just last month, I think it was.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago came up and say, we've been screwing up with our coverage because we've been creating this sense of uncertainty in the stories because we bring skeptic sources into our stories to balance it. We're not going to longer do that.
Right.
Okay, so in some particular cases, I think that has happened. But the overall trend suggests that it's either ignored or it's magnified. And it's hard to come up with that. What's that midpoint where you're actually balancing, acknowledging the uncertainty, but not going out of proportion, making people feel that there's a lot of uncertainty in a particular topic.
Or rather, how can journalists improve public understanding of the fact that uncertainty is gonna exist? Like it's an inherent part of scientific study.
Yeah.
Instead of, having that polarized effect where they're either ignoring it or just saying that all of the stuff that you found means nothing because you're uncertain or you're not 100% absolutely certain
I
about it.
think when it becomes a controversial issue like climate change or this, autism is caused by vaccinations, or the earth is flat, or evolution, that it's the issue that makes it, because we have uncertainty in our lives. Who looks at weather.com every morning, right? Or you turn on the weather channel and it says 80% chance of rain this afternoon and temperature someplace in this range. Nobody knows, but we accept that. Same thing, economic forecasts. We talk about projections on the unemployment rate or what the stock market is going to do over time. So we accept it there because it's not politically controversial to us.
Right.
And so I think it's the climate, not the true garbage skeptics who just stake out an extreme position, but other people get confused because the issue is controversial to them. It's not that the science is controversial.
Mm-hmm. I would just say it's not just in environmental reporting that's an issue. I think in health reporting, health and medical reporting, it's a huge issue. And bad health and medical reporting is all around us. And it takes, a press release on a study that had, 6 subjects and they were all mice. And, the mice all got better. And so this thing is going to cure cancer for you.
Yeah,
and,
and like 1 week chocolate is good for you, another week wine
right,
is good
exactly.
for you.
So I think there's a lot of oversimplifying results and things like that. And I think there's just overall in all kinds of reporting that involves, questions and, uncertainty and quantification and things like that sloppy reporting just sort of takes things and makes an easy assumption.
There's a wonderful John Oliver clip you can find on YouTube about health studies. I've shown it to my class too. So.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But so with you, especially because you do a lot of reporting on academic findings, how do you then parse through that uncertainty?
Well, let me just sort of clarify. We are always having the scholars themselves write the articles about their research. We aren't reporting on it, and we wrestle a lot with that, especially when we're editing them and we're helping them write about what they've done for a scholarly audience.
Right.
But we wrestle a lot with this idea of writing about their own research, because in a typical science journalism article on new research, you would write about the study and you quote someone who was on the study about what you did and what you found, and then you would get someone who was not involved in the study to comment on it and say, well, yeah, this really does move the ball down the road. And by definition, we're sort of doing sole source stories, and our senior science editor is very conscious of that and really polices it. And so we ask them to address what the major questions are about, what they were trying to do, what did they find, what are sort of the biggest concerns you have about it. So we try to ask the scholars to, police themselves a bit and to build those questions in when they write about their own research. And we fact check every single assertion that they make, and our stories all have links in them to research and data sources, and we check every one of those. And it's surprising how sloppy some scholars can be when they're writing about their own scholarship. I mean, some of them will make claims and they'll drop a link in, and you look at it and the link has nothing to do with what they say it does, and you go back to them and they're like, well, of course it does. I'm like, doesn't. So, we do the best we can with that. I mean, we cannot peer review their work. When we are looking to see when someone first, either they pitch an idea to us or a communications person from their school pitches it, or we reach out to them, we look at their biographies, we look at what they've published. Are they writing about the stuff they've worked on? Because sometimes people want to opine about things, and we say, no, this is not your wheelhouse. You're a chemist and you're wanting to opine about invasive species or something like that. We're just like, sorry, you're not the person to do this. Right. So we try to make sure that they are staying in their lane and then really police what they say.
Right, I'm gonna ask one of my questions. I have way too many questions. So you guys talked about the dangers, like the physical dangers that journalists face. So when you guys were all talking, I think just after Eric's presentation too, I was writing down, in matters where journalists have to deal with attacks and intimidation and being threatened physically also, but they're not even like war reporters, they're environmental journalists. How do then the news organizations respond to those threats? And then what if they're not affiliated with a news organization? Like if they're not staff journalists, if they're freelancers, then who watches over them?
Let me try and tackle that in pieces.
Yeah.
For this study, I interviewed Bruce Shapiro. He's the head of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia, which originated right here at MSU, but has since moved on. And he talked about newsroom culture. And is it a supportive newsroom? This whole movement started after the Oklahoma City bombing. And the folks at the Daily Oklahoman, is that what its name is? They saw this trauma among their staff, and they at the top made the decision to make counseling available and confidential therapy available, and started the recognition that the news industry owes an obligation to its employees in the same way that if you're a construction company, you need safety belts and scaffolds that won't collapse when somebody's building a house. And this is the psychological part of it. Some journalists we're all macho regardless of gender, because we can go and do any story, any place, anytime, and before deadline occasionally. And so there's a lot of resistance, especially early on. I think maybe less so now, at least in the West. But a number of the journalists I interviewed are either freelancers or they work for small independent news organizations that have no kind of psychological support structure. They don't have health insurance. If they had health insurance, it wouldn't cover mental health. Or they're in countries where there are no mental health services. I mentioned Liberia had one. I interviewed a Nigerian journalist who eventually went into self-exile in the US, put on illegal drilling by the energy industry. And she said the same thing, like there would have been nobody for her to talk to in her country, a social worker, a psychiatrist, a psychologist. So that's part of it. And that's why some people give up and others feel reinvigorated by the fact that they were targeted, and they feel kind of righteous in a sense in their mission. Nobody would have beat me up or sued me unless I threatened them. And it means I have the power to use the media to threaten or to expose or to embarrass or to get somebody sent to prison.
On
On the
the
legal side, Eric, the legal side.
Oh, well, okay, the journalist from India I mentioned, freelancer, soon as the head of, she was reporting on the rose industry. And the industry was growing roses in Africa. And she was reporting on this, and there was corruption and payoffs and all of that. And the company president threatened to sue her for $1 gazillion. And the company she was freelancing for cut her off. They got a phone call from the president of the rose company or from somebody else, or the lawyers in the demand letter, yanked her story, retracted her story, which really pissed her off. And then no more assignments, so she was persona non grata for that. So there was no financial support from there, but there was a legal defense fund for journalists based in London that did provide some financial support. And then there was some journalists and senior editors at other news organizations in and out of the country who were reporting on her situation and keeping Committee to Protect Journalists informed, because there are some advocacy groups out there as well, not just for environmental journalists, but for journalists in trouble.
What did the Canadian do?
yeah.
What did he do? Well, he dropped out of jail. Well,
He went to jail. He
well,
was arrested.
right. He was arrested several times. His equipment was seized, and it was his psychological problems were complicated. I didn't get into it because his partner died during the time this was going on. This was this is longer than Standing Rock, where I interviewed a couple of journalists who were arrested there too. But the Canadian, the mass media just ignored his plight, and because he didn't have a major news organization behind him, even if you were a freelancer for AP or Agence France Presse, at least there's a structure there, an institution that's got some kind of clout. I interviewed not an environmental journalist, but another journalist in Tajikistan who was a correspondent for BBC, and he was arrested because he wrote about terrorism, so that meant he had to be a terrorist. And because he was affiliated with the BBC, the British government and the Foreign Office got involved, and he got out of jail after a month pending trial. So he, although a freelancer, still had some kind of support, but a lot of the people you talk about in Vietnam or Myanmar, there's nothing, it's just them.
If they're working with us, we're at the point now where we do provide insurance if they're in the field for us, like they go somewhere for a couple of weeks. And we've helped get people out of jail in Brazil, and us, and like you mentioned, kind of conglomerate of organizations sometimes will get behind reporters, and that's usually how the ones that get out of jail get out. And I think again it goes back to the point I was making about being a sole enterprise. The freelancer has to really know the laws and rules in their country and be aware of, even inside the US, right? Like different states have different laws about consent for recording. So in New York State, I can record somebody without their consent. It's legal. I could use it in a story. In Washington State, where I live, you can't do that. It's not legal. I have to get consent. So it's up to the reporters in each country to know, like, this is going to be really dangerous. We need insurance, and then we can help provide it. And we also do like really regular check-ins. If the editor is particularly worried, like check-in, that's pretty standard. Check-in certain regular periods, let us know you're okay and haven't fallen off the map. But then somebody's phone breaks or they don't have a way to get in touch, and it's just kind of, I think it's just a combination of things but it really, the reporter themselves has to be very, very keenly aware of the laws and the rules and what they're risking. Right. Because the editors in New York or wherever, they can't know every little detail. I mean, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. I want to know your opinion mostly. You've all talked about environmental journalism as producing stories for media about this kind of topics, but I wanted to know if you think environmental journalism can be exercised from communications. area, like I don't know, like mediating between companies and affected communities. I don't know. Do you think that's journalism or that's just communications? I don't know if you,
Do you have an example or like a kind of sort of?
I don't know how to explain it, but is it just like producing stories? You know, do something different. I don't know. You can use your skills as a journalist, but help from another area. I don't know how to explain that. Yeah, something like that. Do you think
Like
that,
conflict resolution kind of thing? Or just
yeah, or help, I don't know, communities or companies. Yeah, I don't know if you think that's journalism too, or that's a different kind of thing.
Yeah. And I'm not saying those are important things to do, but I think it just gets very muddy of who are you representing. I mean, and especially if it's a tense situation at all, I think you want to be clear about who you're representing and why you're doing it. So,
because then you're not really an unbiased kind of
right.
independent.
Yeah.
But you know what some of the online publications have been doing are kind of like convening around an issue that they're reporting and bring in multiple perspectives to an actual physical meeting. And so is that a proper function of a journalist? Maybe not, but maybe it's the proper function of this particular organization that happens to be very interested in those issues. Is it a good thing to do?
And in our program, we have a lot of folks who graduate and go to do work in other places outside of news media. And I'm looking at Caressa right now as one example. Caressa, a long time journalist, graduated from a master's program and now works for ESPP. She can surely write and do a lot of journalism, but I don't think that you would characterize your work as journalism at this point, right? But you use the tools and you do a great job because you know, communicating ESPP's output. So yes, I would not characterize this as journalism, but certainly the tools that make their work much better.
So I have a question in general. We were talking about sources and credibility and how hard it can be to have access to credible sources, especially for environmental issues. So this is more of like a developing and developed world kind of. What? What's up?
Hello.
Did you have a question, Walter?
Hello.
Hello?
Say hi.
Okay. All right, so I was talking about the kind of how do you navigate the challenges of finding and quoting and attributing quotes to direct quotes to sources in the government at a time when the Trump administration is actively removing factual information from the public domain. So like just deleting information about climate change or emissions and reports and kind of appointing people who are actively avoiding the terms that we've kind of been used to in the last administration and reporting on. And so how do you then find people to go on the record and talk to you when the administration that they work for is actually taking that information away from the public domain?
Just keep digging.
But how do you get, like, because you can't really, if you're going to say all of it yourself, then that's an opinion piece, but then how do you get people from that administration to actually talk to you about it?
I'm seeing a lot more stories quoting former EPA employees and former such and such because they can't get people in those agencies to talk. So I think certainly in the Obama administration, you didn't see a ton of articles quoting former Bush administration officials because there, you know, I mean, the Obama administration had their own issues with access, but it was nothing like this. Right?
I think I would just add to that the power of having good sources, long-term relationships with sources.
Right.
They know that they can trust you, and you know, in some cases maybe go on the record confidentially without their name. That kind. I mean, sometimes it does have to go to that point.
But I mean, even if you do have like a good sort of long, strong relationship, and you've cultivated your sources, and you do produce like a credible story, which you or your news organization does. What happens when an entire administration is kind of focused on delegitimizing the media? And so anything that you say, even though it's factually accurate, is going to get discounted as fake news because the administration is just putting that kind of culture out there. And how have you guys been navigating that whole fake news thing, or just kind of delegitimization?
Manga-based coverage is definitely more focused internationally,
Right?
And we just don't have like a foot in that water of U.S. Media coverage. I think the coverage we have done, we just do what journalists do. We just try to keep digging, go to the sources. If our first pick, just like in the story that was told earlier, just keep hammering, keep asking, and yeah, I mean, we just have to